So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Frank Forkin, Ipsos's automotive sector client leader. Frank, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. So first, welcome back to all of you who've joined some of the previous sessions based off of some of the work we've done on COVID and our Navigator program. And then we also have some newbies, so welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. We actually have people in Germany and California joining, so great to have everybody aboard. So today we're going to talk, this is our third installment around the whole COVID situation, how it's affecting automotive. And it also syncs up with our Navigator study, which we happen to be in our second wave. And we'll go into that in a second. So Mike, if you could flip the next slide, or John. Okay, one more, John. Okay, so today, first, we're going to just talk a little bit about some of the general EV insights that we're getting from our non-Navigator publications and reports. So Mike's going to be talking about that. Also, a market update on what the experts are talking about regarding sales volumes with respect to EVs. John's then going to take the mobile Navigator study on the EV side. He'll go through that module, and we'll provide you guys some of our takeaways and recommendations at the end. So a lot of really good information. If you go to the next slide, John. Before we go to the actual presentation, I just want to make sure everybody know where the data comes from. So as you can see on the left hand of the slide, Ipsos has got a ton of different resources we're using to gather information around COVID. We've been doing the research since it all started in March, and we're actually conducting weekly updates and surveys for 15 different countries, including the US, of course. So Mike will be pulling from that source from the different pieces, in particular our essential study, which is really our COVID tracker. And then John, like I mentioned earlier, he'll be pulling from the second module of his Navigator syndicated study, which has a strong focus on electrification and electric vehicles. So just give you guys a sense of where the data is coming from. John, if you can flip the next slide, and I'm going to be turning over to Mike. It's all yours, Mike.
All right, thanks, guys. Thanks, Frank. Let me just grab control. Oops, wow, hold on.
I turn off my mic there.
Sorry, guys, I'm not getting control. Oh, there we go. All right. So for those of you who have joined us before, we've shared this data before, and this comes from, as Frank mentioned, our tracking, our weekly tracker. We do one in a lot of different countries, but this comes from the US. And one of the questions we ask is when COVID passes, when we're out of this situation where we're restricted and somewhat locked down, what transportation sources will you return to? So looking at people who drove their own vehicle or use ride sharing or use public transportation, what we saw over the last 6 weeks, which is the last time we did an update, is that there was a large push back toward, I'm going to go back to driving my own vehicle. So that's actually up 11 percentage points from 6 weeks ago. And that was actually coming from groups that were both previously saying, I'm going to delay that choice and see when things are safe and then go back, or I'm just not, going back to driving at all. I may just stop using altogether. So that's obviously really good news. Confidence in, sort of controlling my own environment is one of the reasons, and we'll share a bit on that in a bit, why people go back to cars. When it comes to ride sharing and public transportation, they're not quite as good a spot in terms of people returning. It has improved a bit. We're up to 32% saying I'll go back to ride sharing immediately, public transportation up to 29%, but those are far, far less percentages than what we're seeing for vehicles. Now we ask people, how often do you actually drive your vehicle in a typical week? And the US is a very driver-centric country. And almost half of Americans spend at least 5 days a week in their vehicle. So in fact, a quarter of them are spending 7 days a week, either as a driver or as a passenger. But what's interesting is when we ask them, post-outbreak, when restrictions are lifted, what's your anticipation, not just on daily use, but the amount of miles I'll drive? And for the most part, people said, yeah, I'm going to pretty much drive about the same amount, 56%, and 15% actually believe they're going to drive more. But what's interesting is despite the heavy use and the plan to go back to cars, 29%, so the second largest percentages, say that I'm going to actually be driving less miles. Kind of continuing on, and this is data we've shared in the past as well, looking at people's expectations for commuting to work. We're up to now 37%. That's up 4 percentage points from 6 weeks ago. Believe that their commute will change. And when we look at that change, here's the interesting thing, is we saw a greater shift toward having to drive to work. So that's up to now 57% of that audience who thinks things are going to shift or going to change. That's 11 points higher than 6 weeks ago. And working from home, which was at one time up to 30%, has continued to drop. It was down to 24%, now it's down to 18%. So where we're seeing this movement of that expectation in the change is no longer as great an expectation to work from home. It's now I'm going to likely have to drive to work as an alternative, taking public transportation or some other mode of transportation to get to my work. We also wanted to look at an update on some of the types of drives people are taking during COVID. So we did ask this question. This was last asked, I think, back in, I want to say June, or it's just being cut off here, but it was a while ago that we asked this. And what we're noticing is that a couple of things have dropped in terms of the types of drives I'm taking in the COVID time period, but these are natural drops. These are things we expected. So driving my kids to school has gone down 20 percentage points, but more and more across the country, we're seeing kids doing virtual schools, online schools. And so the need to drive them to school is naturally down. So that's not unexpected. Also, vacation drives are down 9 percentage points. But this, again, when we did this update, then this was in first part of September, vacation time, if you will, the summer vacation period is over. And so again, we were expecting that to decline. What's interesting is that so many of these other activities, going out to a drive-in restaurant or to a drive-in movie or going camping or picnicking or whatever it might be, these are all up. Small amounts, but continue to grow slightly. People are getting more let's say, creative and dependent on using their vehicle for different ways to get out of the house, but still be in an environment that is controlled. That also led us to a previous look at what we were calling safe haven features. And we updated this again, actually added a few more what we would call COVID-like features to see how the American consumer is reacting to this. And what we're seeing is, and you see in this chart, are those items that are sort of blue with the highlights. Those are what we would call the features that are related to creating a safe environment within the vehicle. So not safety, but a safe environment. Collision avoidance we added, as well as a few others, because we wanted to have something that we knew was important or people responded to kind of anchor off and see how these other ones compared. And what's interesting is while collision avoidance was the most, let's call it essential, which is that darker green portion of the bar at 24%, interior cabin filtration systems and touchless door and liftgate trunks, those two had the most preferred at 48 and 46%. But what's also notable is that so many of these have either, sort of a combined, let's call it desire of over 50%. And so it does reinforce what we were seeing earlier a bit, this notion that the vehicle can be my means of transportation and keep me in sort of a protected world, right, where I can control it. But having these additional features or assistance to keep that environment even safer is definitely something consumers are receptive to. Now, this next module that we're going to be sharing with you, as Frank mentioned, is really about electrification. So one of the things we wanted to know was, how do Americans feel about electric vehicles? And overwhelmingly, the attitude is pretty positive. So if you look at sort of the combined, I have a very positive view of electric vehicles and somewhat positive, that's 68%. So over 2/3 of Americans share that feeling. Only about 11% are saying that they really don't know much about that to give us an opinion. Very few are very negative about it. So again, a very sort of positive look. And with that, want to kind of look back at where electric vehicle sales were. And this was actually shared by our friends over at LMC Automotive, and they do forecasting across the globe. And this is a look from their global forecast or their global outlook on battery electric vehicles. And what we were seeing before the outbreak, so from 16 to 2019, it was this continued growth, whether we were looking at the United States or in China, where it's a very strong market and was still growing, or even in Europe, where we saw a big jump from 2018, 2019 in terms of the percent change in sales of battery electric vehicles. Overall, 25% growth from 18 to 19 across the globe. But then the pandemic hit. And what we saw was where global sales in 2019 were 1.6, we were expecting to get up to 2.2 million. And unfortunately, with COVID, we saw a fallback. But here's the interesting thing. Even with that fallback, EVs have held pretty strong. In fact, they're projected to come in at 1.8 million, which is still better than 2019. And what's surprising is that in a somewhat down year in sales for automotive in general, especially in those months where we were seeing shutdowns of plants and production being halted and things of that nature, it still maintained its position in terms of sales, somewhat steady, just slightly higher. And this is actually a slightly better outlook than what we saw when this was last shared from LMC. We were at 1.7 million expected for 2020, so we're up another 100,000 units. But the really exciting thing is when you look forward beyond that, looking at 2021, an expected 70% growth in global BEV sales, up to 3.1 million. And that's really spurred by a lot of programs that were delayed, a lot of sales from people that have sort of put off during the pandemic. They're going to be reinvigorated. These programs are going to be launching again, and sales will be promoted in 2021. That's the expectation. And if you forward 2022, another big jump, another 46% on top of that, 4.5 million units. And the projection is by 2030, BEV sales are going to encompass about 15% of global automotive sales. So a very positive outlook moving forward. These are very important programs for auto manufacturers. All right, so I'm going to dive a little bit into a bit of the Navigator data. And typically, John is really doing this section, but I wanted to kind of weave in what we just talked about with BEVs and sort of the American consumers and what we're looking at in terms of COVID. And how does that kind of play with what we are monitoring and measuring in the electrification module of Navigator. So before we do that, just to give you a little background on Navigator, and John will certainly expand on this. Navigator, for those of you who haven't seen this, is a study where we're looking at various technologies and features and trends in the auto industry. And each module is a little different. This one happens to be very focused on electrification. It's 11 markets that we're doing this in. There's roughly 2,000 responses in every market. And you can kind of see the general split of male and females, pretty even. In this sample, skews a little younger at 42% for Gen Z and millennials, so on and so forth. All right, so that's the general profile of what we have in Navigator. And when we look at the electrification module, where our focus is we're looking at certainly COVID and how it's impacting the automotive consumer. And in this case, we're going to look a bit at the BEV Considerer. It does include the questions and the model for what we call IPAC, which is the Ipsos Pandemic Adaptability Continuum. We shared that with you last time. What that was, I'm going to give you a highlight on where it stands today among BEV consumers. But then more specifically around electrification, we look at attitudes around different powertrains, gas versus electric engines, the acceptance and interest of the variances of electric vehicle offerings, barriers to and even benefits of an EV as it's seen from the different consumers, and then a battery of information around that buyer and who they are and so on. So when I kind of cut into that same data of what we just saw, that profile, but we look at it among BEV considerers, we see a little different composition. So about 30% of the American consumers say they would be a considerer of a BEV for their next vehicle purchase. That's roughly a sample of almost 600 people. And we are skewing a little younger in this case. So that composition of those consumers, about 52%, more than just over half of them are Gen Y and Z, and it skews much more male. The other interesting note is where they reside. So while major cities is still a large population within module 2 of our sample base, and it is also for these BEV considerers, what we see is a much larger proportion also coming from the suburbs. Now, part of that is the United States, and we have a lot of suburban living. So that is also part of the contribution to that point. All right, so let's hone in on the BEV considerers and COVID. And so this is one of the questions we ask as part of the IPAC model. And we ask, how are you feeling about your current situation? Where are you at, sort of, what phase are you in? And predominantly Americans, and in the case of BEV considerers, we are in this phase we call adapting to restrictions, right in the middle there, 44%, that's the bulk. But where it shifts, and I'm comparing this to general US vehicle owners, is that BEV considerers tend to be a little more on the early end of this, or to the left of that midpoint, where we feel like we're still getting ready for new restrictions, or reacting to sort of the day-to-day restrictions that are being placed, and less BEV owners than what we would see normally for vehicle owners, less BEV considerers, I should say, are feeling that restrictions are being lifted. So a little more negative, or let's call it restrictive point of view. In terms of frustration, very similar. What we're seeing is that the BEV considerer is feeling more frustration than the general US vehicle owner, right? So there is, while the bulk of us are all sort of in that midpoint 3, we see more kind of feeling more frustrated when you're talking about BEV considerers. And then we also, when we look at how are they feeling about the future post-COVID, there's more uncertainty. In fact, 6 percentage points higher for people that are BEV considerers saying they're feeling stuck or have a lot of uncertainty is also higher, slightly higher for these considerers. So the general outlook, and it kind of comes out, and I'll show you in a minute in the IPAC model, is a little more negative among this group than it is for general automotive consumers. Now, what is motivating people to buy? Now, these are the general reasons, and John's going to get into the more BEV reasons, but generally why people that are considering a BEV are going to shop for a new vehicle is that feeling of safety and being protected in a personal vehicle. That's an important factor, and we saw it a bit with the safe haven features. Right now, there's also a good part that is saying, hey, I expect a good deal, right? The auto manufacturers are going to motivate me through deals to buy a new vehicle. They're expecting that to happen, but almost half of them are saying it's feel safe and protected in a personal vehicle. All right, so here's the IPAC model, and again, without showing you all the details behind it, and for those of you that are new to this, I can talk through it. We can talk offline and share a little bit of how this is constructed. But it was really those 3 questions that you saw about what phase am I in, what's my outlook on the future, and how frustrated I am. And when we look at that, while most everybody is still in this acclimation phase, and by the way, that's where we feel like we're just kind of dealing with the restrictions that we have, we see more of the BEV considerers in those early phases of preparation and adjustment, and less across future phases. Again, there's a little more of a, I'm not quite feeling like we're coming out of this yet kind of attitude. So that's a general depiction of the automotive consumer, in particular the BEV considerers. So at this point, I'm going to turn the conversation back over to John. He's going to go a little deeper into the mobility navigator and kind of tie this all together. John?
Great. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. So let's, like I say, let's dive into this. This is interesting what you've shared so far. Now we'll get into a little more of the details of what we have from our EV module. And what I'm showcasing initially here is one of the key areas we've been tracking actually for some time. Actually, we've had our navigator solution since 2017, but I'm highlighting here the differences between BEV consideration between 2019 and 2020. Of course, it's very interesting because of what's transpired with COVID and what's going to happen with BEV interest. We saw from the early forecast from LMC, we are seeing it's expected to weather the storm globally as it relates to BEV sales. But what we would say and what we're seeing from the data is a slight difference regionally where we see that BEV consideration. We are seeing it's increasing for the US and China, but it's a little more tempered for Europe and even perhaps a decline for Brazil. And so this is, of course, reflective of the time where we are. We know in Brazil in particular, COVID's been spreading more disproportionately, so that could perhaps some of their reservation there, also with the financial uncertainty, but nevertheless, seeing this update in the resilience and the claim data from consumers is definitely interesting to see so far. And then let's dig a little bit about what could be contributing to this. Let's understand what's happening on the level of familiarity by region. So we asked a very generic question, how familiar are you with battery electric vehicles? And so what we are charting here is a top two box by the key regions, and it's know a fair amount and know a little bit. And overall, we see, overall familiarity for BEVs is fairly strong with, very strong numbers overall across all the key regions. And then roughly about 1 in 4 knowing a fair amount across the respective key regions. In particular, we're not necessarily too surprised to see that China has the most familiarity based on the focus on BEVs in that country and what we're seeing as the sales. We saw that from LMC and we continue to see that, but nevertheless, it's not surprising to see a spike in level of familiarity in that market. And then now, what we would say is, how does this familiarity translate into BEV consideration? Now we're focusing a bit here on just the US market, so we can get a sense of this, but ultimately, what does that do to BEV consideration? So we're looking at those people who say they know a fair amount versus, and we're calling them familiar, and those people and the rest we would say is not familiar, and then just look at the data of what is their level of BEV consideration, and what do we see? And that's pretty dramatic difference in BEV consideration by if you know some information, in particular here in the US, and that is, a 2x factor of level of BEV consideration if you know something about those BEVs. That is definitely encouraging to see. So as you gain awareness, gain knowledge, that does translate increasing purchase consideration. And again, we're just highlighting here just the US. We do see some differences across our countries that we take a look at. Of course, with the full subscription and view of this data, you would get that. But nevertheless, just gives you a snapshot of what you could get from the full set of the data. And now if we try to understand what do we mean by level of familiarity, so we just said this idea of they know a little bit, but we asked some questions as it relates to activities that these people have done in the last year. Right now, we're looking at it from a global view, and we're comparing this idea of those BEV considerers versus the non-considerers, and what types of activities have they participated in. And what we are seeing is that those people who are a BEV considerer, they have, and I guess you could say they've been more engaged, right or wrong, and perhaps that what we would argue has been influenced by what they've seen. This idea, they've seen advertising, they've noticed some BEVs on the road, they've even seen charging stations. And as a result, we're seeing is that they're even looking for more information. So what we would say is this idea of, marketing is definitely beneficial and getting the product out there, and that level and seeing it just that increases that comfort. That level of familiarity just grows, and it just broadens your willingness to accept it. And I would say I'm evident. I'm actually in California. That's where I'm located in the Bay Area in San Francisco. And so BEVs is for those who aren't aware, is very popular in California. It's very evident. We see them a lot. We see charging stations. You see what amounts to these solutions on the road. So that level of familiarity does grow, and therefore that you're more confident and just comfortable with it. And so as a result, that definitely has a positive impact on what amounts to is that BEV consideration. And then now, we touched on one of the things that you can get from this study is this idea of understanding of different needs. What does the consumers want generically? So we asked, we're pulling an excerpt of what is an important driver for selecting of a new vehicle. So we're looking at this compared to total globally, and then looking at BEV considerers and seeing how do they differ. And ultimately, we're not, I guess you could say surprised by the results in total, right? They're kind of your usual suspects, this idea of value for money, price, QRD, and but where we see this, where it gets a little interesting, is this idea of the BEV considerer, right? There's this split, and what we see is, price isn't the number one factor, or technically the second factor for these people. Of course, value for the money, if you're showing you're getting something for it, that's going to be important for BEV considerers, but the absolute price isn't that main thing for them. Again, this is just a global view. This just gives you a sense of what it is, but it varies by country. But nevertheless, what we would say is interesting to see this, I guess, underlying need for a BEV considerer coming through. And then we also asked, just generically, what are the concerns about driving a vehicle with a traditional gas, / diesel engine globally? Again, looking at between BEV considerers and non-BEV considerers and what's happening. Again, just understanding those needs of these consumers, and again, it gives you the opportunity to dig in. But what we see is that, similar perceptions between the BEV considerers and non-considerers. We do see this idea universally, fuel prices is of the mindset for consumers. This idea of environmental impact, and then this, repair and maintenance costs float to the top for both groups. We do see slight variations as the magnitude, right, as it relates to emissions versus the non-considerers, a little bit more important for them. But still, what we see is fuel prices is right there with them, right? It's not just about emissions. It is about the pricing and what it means to them in their pocket on being able to use and operate these vehicles. But again, we've slightly different results by country, but this just gives you a high-level view of what we're seeing. Now, if we take a look and a build on, Mike shared a little bit about what is that BEV considerer profile. What do they look like? And this just is a compare and contrast between that global BEV considerer versus that non-considerer. What do they look like? And what we are seeing is this notion of that they're an early adopter profile that is broadening, is what we would say, right? They tend to be younger, they tend to be male, they tend to be living in a metropolitan area. Their income tends to be a little bit higher. But what we do see, and I've illuminated here, is they tend to be, like I say, more likely to be an early adopter versus that non-considerer. But we also see is that a couple other things that pop for them is that they're embracing more of the technology, as we would say. They desire that digital assistant in the vehicle. They trust ADAS features and functionality. So they are just more interested in tech overall. But another interesting thing that's here at the bottom between the BEV considerers and non-considerers is that minimum acceptable range. We see the BEV considerer isn't as what do you call doesn't require as much as the non-considerer, which is interesting, right? It's this idea of there's a balance, and we'll get into that a little bit of what is important to them, because it isn't necessarily just about range. And then, so ultimately, what we would call as the top 5 benefits impacting BEV consideration? And what we see, and we asked a variety of different elements here, again, just taking a snapshot globally between the total and those BEV considerers. And we do see similar things pop for both groups. This idea of environmental, this idea of convenience and being able to charge at home comes up, and then cost of ownership are those top benefits impacting BEV consideration overall. But the one thing is we saw on this is that you might say, yeah, I've heard that, I understand that, and that makes sense in total. But we wanted to dig into this a little further beyond that, what we would call as our stated ratings, to understand this a little bit in more detail. And so what we've done is and take a look at what amounts to is these stated ratings. These are all the attributes put here on this quad map to understand what is that impact to BEV consideration. And so we look at the stated ratings here, and you see the top of the chart. These are the items that are revealing, again, as I guess most stated as being impactful for BEV consideration. This is, we're taking a focused view on the US, and say, it's this idea of less pollution, recharging at home, less maintenance, things like these are what is going to cause people to be interested in BEVs. But we wanted to delineate and understand is, okay, but what is really driving purchase consideration? So we did a regression analysis to reveal that the derive, which of these dimensions are truly explaining the change in purchase consideration. And what we revealed some true benefits, some things to focus on, and that's in our derived bucket here. And these things that are floating to the top is this idea of attractive styling, this access to express lanes, this idea of a carpool, HOV lanes, advanced technology. We saw that earlier on the BEV considerers. What are the things that they want? It's this idea of advanced technology. But the thing that illuminates here is this idea of styling comes into play, right? It's that they just don't want a BEV for the sake of a BEV. They want an attractive vehicle. They want to. These are the things that are going to make a difference for consumers. So understanding both of these is certainly going to be helpful when you go to market the products, right? You need to have an attractive product, and you may say, oh, of course we know that, but this just really illuminates it for understanding of what you're going to get the majority of people is with an attractive vehicle. Some of these convenience benefits, this idea of access to the express lanes is beneficial, and then having some of these other these benefits of charging at home and less pollution and things like this. But having this is certainly key information. Again, we dig into this with the full results. You have differences by country and even globally, but nevertheless, this is a key point to build on. And then we phrase some questions, and again, this idea of this exterior styling. What do we mean by that? So we asked a simple question is, and now I look again at the global, just so you get a perspective, but, what kind of exterior design do they prefer? And we're looking at the total BEV considerers versus non-considerers, and we see that the greatest percentage is people just want it to look the same. They don't really care that it's different. We see, like I say, the majority of them saying the same or no preference, right, in total. And then if we look at the BEV considerers, there is this idea of, okay, maybe slightly different would be helpful, but what it highlights is, and again, that an important driver for adoption is the idea it's attractive. They just want an attractive looking vehicle. Of course, nobody wants to drive an ugly vehicle just to say that they drive a BEV, but we are, like I say, seeing these results, it just validates what we know, but still this idea of touching on what is ultimately going to be important and get people to adopt the BEVs, and this idea that attractive styling is definitely going to be beneficial. And then we asked some questions about, okay, well, what's preventing you for, what amounts to is adopting of a BEV. What are those barriers? Again, looking at the global results, we're looking at total and BEV considerers. What shows up? Of course, we see battery life. That would imply this idea of the duration of that battery. How long is it going to truly last? This idea of driving range, public charging time, and then affordability. So, in short, of course, touch on the affordability. We would say incentives are certainly beneficial for the category, as we know that certainly helps make the battery electric more affordable for the consumer. But what's interesting is this idea of meeting of what we call the minimum driving ranges for consumers. And one thing of the BEV considerers is that driving range, this range on a single charge, is not as important from the BEV considerers versus the total. We're seeing charging time is more important. It's that idea, if you think of your weekly, your daily use, it's how much time are you, I guess you could say investing in charging versus not. That's going to be more important to that BEV considerer. So certainly that's an important insight to realize. And again, this is global, slight differences by country, but nevertheless, that's an important takeaway. And then this is just really to help showcase some of what's capable in the breadth of our study. What I'm looking at here is what is the intention by vehicle segment? What are we seeing? And then we pose some questions to understand is would they consider a BEV in that their preferred segment? And overall, we're seeing the midsize car and SUV crossover are the most popular globally of the segments. And you would say, okay, yeah, I know that. But then we want to see is, okay, how likely are the total, just that average consumer, are they interested in getting a BEV in that segment? And then of the BEV considerers, are they interested to getting a BEV in that segment? And of course, and we see, again, differences by country. In particular, this shows up in the segments, right? Because there are those tendencies of, I know the US tends to be larger vehicles versus the globe, and even of pickup trucks versus the rest of the globe. But we are seeing these results. And one thing that also is powerful with what we can do is we can see the different needs and benefits and barriers for each of the vehicle segment intention as well, right? We could slice and cut the data that way. Nevertheless, what we are seeing is some pretty interesting results that most BEV considerers would then follow suit and consider in their preferred segment. We are seeing very high, willingness to do that, except for what we would say is pickup trucks. Again, this is perhaps a little bit watered down because of the global view. We are seeing, and I know been a lot of recent coverage on pickups, especially electrified pickups with the electric F-150 coming out. We saw last year with the Tesla Cybertruck and even with the Rivian R12, there's just a lot of activity coming as it relates to new electrified pickups. So we would see that to be picking up, especially globally as we go forward and as we proceed as the development of the market. And then now let's talk about range expectations. I've touched on that a little bit. We know that's important. Overall, we're seeing on, what is that minimum range people are expecting? Again, globally, we see right now it's hovering about 230 miles on average. That is slightly lower than what we saw in 2019. 2019 was about 5 miles lower than that. But what's interesting here is some countries' range expectation is lower versus 2019, and some is higher. In particular, the U.S. I'll highlight is their expectation is a little higher than what we saw in 2019. It's about average, about an increase of about 10 miles or so of what's being stated. But what's further interesting, again, if we look at the global results of BEV considerers and non-considerers, we're seeing when you just ask what's that minimum range required in order for them to accept it, we're seeing a very large proportion of them, 58% of BEV considerers, it's as long as you pass that 200-mile threshold, you're going to, appeal to the majority of those BEV considerers. Of course, the more range you can offer, the better, and you're going to get more people accepting. But it isn't. necessarily a showstopper, right? That you have to be at 300 miles. I mean, I know I've seen studies, industry studies talking about that. Certainly that is helpful, right? But it's not necessarily a requirement. You can have a very strong value prop of a vehicle with slightly lower range, and that's a matter of addressing other elements. We talk about charging, right, and the speed of that charging, and the absolute price, right? They all go into it. But nevertheless, this is encouraging to see and important to know as relates to what is the expectation amongst the BEV considerers. And then now we're looking at charging location and frequency. What are their expectations? Again, looking globally, we're seeing most people will be doing it from home. We're seeing that especially in the US, with the majority indicating they would do it very often. And likely what's going to happen, it's almost this idea of, just plug and play. You just get into a different rhythm, a different habit of plugging in. You're not going to the gas station weekly or every 2 weeks. That's your activity. But we'll see in other regions, of course, the home is the most popular, but with China, we're seeing an increase usage and work becomes an important play for China. And then Brazil, even at public charging stations, is a higher expectation in that market versus others. And then we would say is, okay, well, what is the preferred payment method for this public charging? And, no surprise, again, looking at global BEV considerers versus US is a similar result, and that's what we say is this idea of pay-as-you-go, right? I know in the US market, it's you're very used to that model, to whatever, what we know for most consumers, that behavior going to any gas station, you're able to get access to it, and you just use it or you pay as you use it, right? When you go to a gas station. So that's, no surprise that we would see that here, but I equate this understanding is that you're not limited to a certain network, because if you get into like a refillable type of a card or even a monthly bill idea, you might be relegated to certain charging network, not necessarily access to all of them. And basically just really depends on your routes and your routines. You're going to want to, if you need a charge, you want to be able to get access to that charge. And so it's no surprise to us the idea is pay as you go, but thinking about that as you would deploy your charging and access, it just makes sense. But nevertheless, that's what we're seeing. And then as we talked about earlier, this idea of charging time is very important. So basically this idea is how fast do they want, a fast charger, a fast public charging up to an 80% charge, and what do they want globally? Overall, we're seeing it's not very long, right? They're expecting it to be about 24 minutes to get you up to that 80% charge. And this is an idea of, think of convenience. If you're out and about and you're public charging, you don't want to be there for hours, of course. And so that's what we see here, this idea of 24 minutes in total. And then when we look at BEV Considerer, it's just slightly longer, not much. But what's interesting is of those who are more knowledgeable of BEV owners is even longer as well. So it shows as you get more educated, more informed, you would have more grace, I guess, on the duration. When we looked at this for the US, it has amongst the longest averages, right, that we've seen. But nevertheless, it's in this neighborhood of what that expectation is. And again, it's not a surprise. It's this idea of, when you go to fill up your gas tank today, right, it's a fairly quick endeavor. But knowing that that's kind of your benchmark, if you will, this is something you're definitely going to want to take advantage of and be aware of on that range. And I just have a couple of little more slides and then we can finish up, but I just thought this would be a little bit fun. We just asked some questions of, what are some of the brands that they would be willing to consider without giving a prompting? We asked, what would they want? And so the top 5 brands across the globe that come up, it's interesting. Tesla is up there, right? It's the only American brand that's come up, but is clearly an owner in the BEV space. But we do see, what amounts to some German and some Japanese OEMs show up here as amongst the leaders. But what's interesting is both Toyota and Honda, while show up in this top 5 list, they don't have what we would call as a current strong BEV solution, right? But they have credibility, right? They can operate in this space. So that's definitely encouraging to see. A little bit of fun, if you will, is we inserted some, I guess you call it current vehicles through press releases that have been, made the ways on Auto News and whatnot. We didn't offer any specs or prices or images. I just put those in here for illustration purposes. Just ask, what vehicles would they consider? This is looking at the US, and we see the top 5 is both mainstream and premium brands coming up. These are going to be on the list of these BEV considerers, of these upcoming models that will be coming out. So again, I think it's interesting to see what would be in that consideration set for consumers, and just knowing that there's a lot of competition coming, and there's going to be I guess you could just say that a lot of competition for these buyers. So, but there's a lot of new and attractive things coming out. So, fun times indeed coming up. So, lastly, I would say, we just asked of the non-considerers, what would it seriously take to consider a BEV? While we know what's motivating for a BEV considerer, as I've mentioned earlier, this idea is, what do they want? They want slightly longer battery ranges. We've kind of touched on what does that mean? This idea of affordability, faster charger times, what does that mean? Having an increased infrastructure. I think it's the awareness that that infrastructure is there, because most people don't recognize it, but getting that more illuminated. But something that pops here, this idea of an included 240 volt level 2 home charger as part of the purchase of the vehicle. Make it convenient for them. Get them past that last hurdle. So they're going to do home charging. We saw that. Make it easy for them, right? I mean, illustrate that, hey, this is part of the solution of using this vehicle, and there's an opportunity there for sure. So just as a recap, what did we learn? This idea, the car is king. Consumers desire their vehicle. They, as Mike alluded to, this idea of they're driving longer distances, or they're not as driving as long distances, but they're using it for more occasions. We're also seeing that, EVs, impression is positive out there. People want, an EV. It's a good thing. So, but they just need some more information, more familiarity with it. We learned with the IPAC model, this idea is they're still in this recovery phase. So they're a little bit more cautious. They just need a little bit more information for their purchase to help increase their, I guess you'd say, their comfort level. We are seeing this idea of awareness. The experience of BEVs is growing. So we would say marketing is helping, and it's certainly helping move that BEV consideration going forward. What are some of the key elements? We saw stated-wise, environmental, the convenience of home charging, cost of ownership. But what we would say is what's driving adoption is this idea of attractive styling, access to express lanes, HOV, renewable energy, and advanced technology. Certainly communicating both of these elements for that new BEVs that are coming out will certainly be helpful. Barriers of what we would say is the battery life, the range, the public charging station, or the availability of public charging stations, what's out there, the recharging time and affordability, and then again, to get people over that hump. It's, of course, addressing these items, but then give them something extra. This idea, if you can include a level 2 charger, that certainly would be beneficial. But ultimately, it's, like I say, these are a lot of key learnings that we have from our study. We've highlighted just a few, and I just leave you with this. There's 3 key reasons of trying to subscribe to the Navigator. We would say it's broad study, 11 countries this year, a lot of deep insights you can glean, 2,000 completes of new car owners per country, so a lot that you can gain from that. And ultimately, we have learning as relates to the impact of COVID, plus what we would be doing that throughout the year. So we've touched on it a little bit. We have more that we could share as part of a subscription, but nevertheless, it is something we continue to monitor because COVID's not going away. In the immediate future, I hope it goes quicker, but it hasn't been. But nevertheless, it will continue to monitor it. And then lastly, I would say we have the 3 areas of disruption that we've been monitoring. We've covered autonomous. This is our electrification. Shared mobility will be happening in early December. we'll be sharing those results, again, in a format like this. So look for invite on that. But nevertheless, it's just a lot of good information you can get. And we could certainly, like I say, partner with you. Just let us know if you're interested, and certainly would follow up. So with that, I don't know if any questions or anything have come up, Frank, but certainly I know looks like we ran a little long than I anticipated, but nevertheless, there's a lot of good information I had to share here, and hopefully you guys agree and appreciate it. But nevertheless, I don't know, Frank, if there's any questions.
Yeah, no, John, thanks, and Mike, great job. There are a few questions, but we're going to have to answer them offline. So we'll take those offline just in lieu of the time. And we look forward to seeing a lot of you in the next. John, when is that mobility readout? And is that November or October?
It will be, actually the next one will be after Thanksgiving, but of course before the holidays, but in early December. We don't have the exact date yet because we're not in field yet, but it will be in early December that we will.
Okay. John, can you elaborate a little bit on when you say mobility, the things that you're actually going to be looking at, because that's a pretty broad subject for that last wave?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's a good question. So it's a shared mobility. So it does cover off on what we call as ride sharing. Of course, we have, car sharing, we have micromobility, we have a variety of topics as it relates to the service side and utilization of the variety of services that you can have there. So it isn't just limited to ride hailing, but that certainly is covered.
Okay, great. All right, thanks again, everybody. Appreciate the time. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Frank and John and Mike, for today's really interesting presentation. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. There were a number of questions, and those are going to be answered by email later today. You will also receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation. And remember, there are handouts in the event console, so please go ahead and download those today. We welcome the opportunity to speak to you at any time, so please feel free to reach out to us. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.